This video contains detailed descriptions of real-life violence, murder, and forensic investigation. Viewer discretion is strongly advised. Some content may be disturbing to sensitive audiences. Please proceed with caution. On December 18, 1986, Christmas festivities were underway in the small town of Creusot, located in France's Saône-et-Loire department. However, there was one woman who wasn't anywhere near as celebratory. First, her father had recently been in a traffic accident, and she needed to visit him in the hospital. Second, she was waiting for her children, and one of them, 16-year-old Christelle Maillery, hadn't arrived. She called her daughter's friends, but they hadn't seen her. Then she called her school. Christelle was allowed to leave school early at 11 a.m., and they hadn't seen her since. Next, she called all the local hospitals in case she had been admitted. Once more, Christelle was nowhere to be found. It was now time to inform the police. The police were not very helpful. They assumed she was a runaway and asked whether she could have been with friends instead. Eventually, she had to leave to tend to her father at the hospital. Tragically, even if the police rushed into action right away, they would have made no difference. 250 meters away from their home was the Le Charmel building, an apartment/social housing complex. While she was speaking with the police, a resident of the building simultaneously had to go down to the building's basement/cellar. It was then that they found the dead body of a young girl. In fact, the police cars with their lights and sirens blaring actually drove past Christelle's mother while she was driving to the hospital. The body was found hidden at the back of that bicycle garage, lying on her back. Her clothes were completely untouched, and there were no outward signs of sexual assault to be found. The scene before them was the result of a murder, and the police didn't need much investigative work to figure that out. She had sustained numerous stab wounds on her forearms, chest, back, around the shoulder blades, and lungs. No murder weapon was found at the scene, indicating the killer had taken it with him. Another injury included a slight bruise on her neck. The cause of the bruise seemed to be a small shoelace that was found in the garage. It had likely been wrapped around her neck to try and silence her from screaming, and nothing else, as strangulation wasn't the cause of death. There were no signs of any struggle, and robbery was discounted as the motive. Her purse was round next to her body, and it hadn't been rummaged through. Her jewelry was also not removed. Her damp but neatly folded umbrella was also found at the scene. The fact that her purse was undisturbed is how police identified her as Christelle Maillery at the scene. When the police went to the hospital to meet her mother and break the news to her, tragically, Christelle's grandfather didn't survive his accident, so both her mother and daughter died the same day. According to the autopsy, Christelle had sustained 33 stab wounds throughout her upper body, all of which were likely caused by the same weapon, a weapon that wasn't found in the basement. Each of the wounds had the potential to kill on its own, so excessive overkill was applied. The medical examiner also confirmed that Christelle hadn't been raped or sexually assaulted. While no murder weapon was found, the coroner was capable of concluding what blade was likely used. Likely an automatic switchblade 12 centimeters. Based on the wounds, there was only one killer who likely attacked from behind, stabbing her in the lower right back. Then, to stop her from screaming and to subdue her, he wrapped the shoelace around her neck. During the struggle, she was turned around to face him, causing the killer to stab her in the front of the upper body. Christelle then fell to the ground, where the killer continued to stab her long after she had likely died. It would have happened very quickly with next to no time to struggle. On December 19, the police began their hunt for the murder weapon. They searched every nook and cranny the building had to offer and then rummaged through the surrounding bushes, but to no avail. The police were left to believe that the murder weapon was indeed still with the murderer. The police then retraced the route that Christelle had likely taken. She left school early at 11 a.m. and began her walk home. 10 minutes after leaving the school, 2 schoolgirls passed Christelle. Christelle was alone. 300 meters further, on a path leading up to the building, an older woman saw a young girl in her teenage years under an umbrella accompanied by an older man. The last witness came at 11:30 a.m., a resident of the building, and upon entering, according to the statement, she thought she heard a moan. She listened, paid attention, but it didn't happen again, so she thought to herself, I must have imagined it. This was likely Christelle during her murder. Her route would have only been 13 minutes and the killer was likely a local who knew the area well. They didn't think it likely that a random stranger from outside the village would have known or been able to easily force her into the basement of an apartment building without leaving any traces. Tragically, solving the case didn't seem like it'd be easy. In fact, the local rumor mill, gossip and word of mouth was the best the police had to work with considering the lack of anything else. At the time there was no DNA, phone tracking or any CCTV cameras. The police questioned the woman who saw Christelle with the older man, but she was viewing them from so far away that she couldn't even positively identify Christelle, let alone the man. Christelle herself was described as kind and capable of standing up for herself. She had no enemies, so to speak, of either. The closest thing the police had to a suspect was her boyfriend, whom she had been with for over a year. Perhaps the murder was a crime of passion. The only issue was his alibi. He was at his boarding school in Dijon, over 100 kilometers away. For now, the only conclusion the police were left to make was that she had been killed by an opportunistic prowler or drug addict. That was until they heard of another one, a suspect whose alibi may not have been as airtight as it initially seemed. On the morning of December 18th, there was another teenager, known for putting on his constant, tough guy, act. He was seen pacing back and forth for an hour in front of the building next to the basement. The police were aware of this at the time, but he told him that he was summoned by his teacher to return or pick up some textbooks. That was that until they spoke to the teacher, who told the police that they did no such thing. They questioned him a second time and he admitted to the police that he wanted to see Christelle, that he liked Christelle and that he constantly had his eye on Christelle. Christelle's boyfriend was aware of this and according to him, he had put him in his place. That being said, he then offered another alibi. That he was at an art class at the time of the murder. Another witness soon came forward, a mailman who told the police that on the path leading toward the building, he saw a man running, who even into him slightly. He remembered that, upon reaching the bottom of the path, the man turned onto another avenue and ran out of his field of vision. He described the man as a young man in his 20s, standing at 1.80 meters tall, dressed in jeans and a jacket, with slightly long blonde hair at the nape of the neck. He said that he vaguely resembled the famous singer Renaud. The police then went to all the bars and nearby hangout spots in Le Creusot to be on the lookout for any Renaud lookalikes. At the time Renaud was all over French TV, so many fans likely wanted to mimic his style. This went on for months but to no avail. The case was at a deadlock until February 1987, a passerby was walking at the bottom of a path leading to the crime scene when he discovered something in the bushes. It was a switchblade found 150 meters from the crime scene and a few meters from where the mailman said he was. The blade appeared to be sharpened with a stone and had very distinctive markings on it. It was compared to Christelle's wounds and found to be a match. Sadly, after 2 to 3 months of being buried under snow, having rain fall onto it, more snow burying it again and having the snow on it melt. Any psychical evidence they could hope to find had long since been degraded. That being said, the knife was again, still distinctive in appearance, so the police took pictures of the weapon to publish in all the local newspapers, asking the public to come forward if anyone had ever seen it before. Sadly, this appeal yielded no results. A few weeks later, 2 anonymous postcards were mailed directly to the police. It was directed specifically to the man leading the investigation, with the postcard beginning with, "Good day, Mr. Gichaud." The letter went on to explain that he lived in Nevers, which was over 120 kilometers from Le Creusot. The letter also contained this sentence, "I am Christelle's killer." The police compiled a list of every resident of Nevers who may have had cause to travel to Le Creusot. That included drifters who lived in boarding houses, students on vacation and soldiers. They even visited the 7th Artillery Regiment in Nevers to ask about their personnel. They spent weeks doing this but failed to zero in on a single suspect. By June 1987, they returned to the building to try and look for additional evidence and arrested the boy seen pacing back and forth at the building for a third time. They found no new evidence and finally released the boy for good this time. The police rounded up all the drug addicts, sex offenders, and flashers and even interrogated one of their own officers as a suspect. Every one of them had an alibi and they were all airtight. This was their last-ditch effort, and with it failing, they had nothing. The case finally went completely cold and there was nothing more they could do but just wait and hope a solution came. That solution would become very difficult to obtain after a truly controversial decision was made. In February 1990, a judge at the Chalon-sur-Saône tribunal issued a non-lieu/dismissal order regarding the case. It effectively put an end to the case and declared that there was nothing more to proceed with. With that in mind, the destruction of all the evidence was also ordered. However, according to some, the evidence had already been compromised due to water damage anyway, and it was simply discarded by one of the building's custodians when sent to fix the leak. However it happened, all that remained were crime scene photos and official documents and reports. Periodically, the police would conduct additional rounds of interviews in hopes of finding a breakthrough and keeping the case active, but they still had nothing to go on, so they never made much progress. In 1997, Christelle's devastated mother met the mother of 20-year-old Christelle Maillery, who had also been murdered. The two also learned about the murders of several other young girls and women along the same stretch of road in the Saône-et-Loire department, giving rise to speculations that a serial killer may be responsible. Perhaps both of their daughters fell victim to a case known as the A6 Missing Women. Between August 20, 1984, and April 2, 2005, 10 women/girls between the ages of 13 to 37 went missing or were murdered along the same 200-kilometer stretch of the A6 road in Saône-et-Loire. Because of this, the area has come to be referred to as the Triangle de la Paix. While the cases could be unrelated coincidences, many didn't seem to think so. As both of their daughters shared the same name, they soon formed the Christelle Association, an advocacy group dedicated to campaigning for justice in all of these cases, including public marches and demonstrations. In August 2001, the organization turned to two lawyers from Paris who specialized in cold cases. They were especially well known for their work in the Émile Louis case. Their families also gathered up the money to go to Paris and plead for the case to be reopened once more. They also reached out to the press and various politicians in hopes they would hear their words. The two lawyers, when looking into this case, were devastated when they learnt what had become of the evidence in Christelle's case. By now, it had been 17 years since the murder and they had nothing to go on. They still tried regardless and even hired private investigators to look into leads they could not. They questioned Christelle's boyfriend, now 33 years old. The PI said, "I came across someone quite fragile, quite depressed, let's say." And he was still very, very affected by the story. After some questioning, he finally opened up and told him something he didn't tell the police. He was at a party in either 1989 or 1990 when an old friend came to meet him. He wasn't invited to the party and just went in regardless. Upon reaching him, he confessed to Christelle's murder and offered him 2,000 francs in compensation, in exchange for his silence. He remembered this man well to begin with, but this experience burned him into his memory. According to him, the man was named Jean-Pierre Mura. Jean never came up once during the initial investigation. When asked why he didn't come forward at the time, his answer was quite simple. He didn't believe him. He described Jean as fairly unbalanced, and that he was a drug addict who had lied or made stuff up before. He had ample reason to doubt what he was saying. Christelle's boyfriend also wasn't in a good place mentally back then either, which further contributed to him keeping silent. Before presenting anything to the police, the PI wanted to speak with Jean himself. Jean was now 36 and lived in the attic of his parents' home, a home located in Le Creusot. The first thing Jean said upon seeing him was, "Have you found Christelle's murderer?" He seemed very curious to learn what the PI did and got very nervous when he started asking him questions instead of the other way around. Several times out of nowhere he would ask, "Are there any leads?" This lead was presented to the police and the courts, and with that, Christelle's family finally got some good news. In September 2005, the court ordered the case to be reopened with a new investigator assigned to it. One of the very first actions taken was to detain Jean for questioning. In the absence of any compelling evidence, Jean only spent 3 hours in custody. All he had to say was to deny knowing Christelle or being her killer. He told the police that he was out on a walk that day. When asked about the incident at the party, he accused her boyfriend of being a liar and even said that he was the killer. 6 months after telling the PI about Jean, her boyfriend suffered a heart attack and died so he could be interviewed again. After Jean's release, the case stalled once more, and in 2009, a new officer was assigned to lead the investigation. A man named Raphaël Nedilko. Raphaël had little faith that he would be the one to finally crack the case, but he was determined to try anyway. He'd regularly visit Christelle's grave to serve as a reminder of why he was doing this. Raphaël began the entire investigation completely from scratch and read almost every single piece of documentation that existed on it, from old police reports to old newspaper articles. In 2010, he finally discovered the postcard supposedly written by the killer. Again, all the evidence was gone, so they couldn't examine the letter itself, but pictures of it still existed. The handwriting on the postcard was very similar to Jean's, the most promising lead in nearly 30 years. Raphaël wanted to question Jean right away, but he was told to wait. Only a few days earlier, Jean had been involuntarily committed to a mental hospital. Jean had been wandering the street when he heard voices ordering him to go to the gas station because he perceived insults directed at him, and at his family coming from the establishment. He went to the gas station armed with a knife which he used to threaten the cashier. Rather than demanding money, he demanded that she do everything to stop the insults. Jean remained at the gas station, and even as the cashier called the police right in front of him, he remained almost frozen in place, albeit with violence in his eyes. The police arrived and placed Jean under arrest. This was the incident that led to him being committed. Jean had been threatening the gas station and its employees for a while before the incident. It just so happened to be one that Christelle's mother and stepfather used to work at, with Christelle herself occasionally helping out. While waiting for Jean's bout of psychosis to subside enough to be questioned, Raphaël decided he now had enough cause to question his family, friends and acquaintances. They all talked about the personal notebooks he had and that Jean had been obsessed with the case from the very beginning. He was known to write down details about it regularly and very often found someone different to accuse of being the murderer. In his youth, Jean was described as withdrawn, idle, addicted to cannabis and a petty delinquent, and he and his friends would often break into basements via the side windows or doors that included the apartments where Christelle's body was found. Most of the people Jean accused of being the murderer were all young people from the neighborhood he lived in. When his parents moved to a different neighborhood, Jean would often venture to his old apartment building, the same place where Christelle had lived. People often called Jean the cellar rat, as he typically hung out in the basements of buildings or their cellars, another nail in the coffin. Next, Raphaël asked what Jean looked like when he was 19 and made many trips all across France to question his old friends and gather as many photos of him in his youth as possible. In most of them, he looked similar to a young Renault and matched the description the mailman had given the police. For his alibi, Jean was said to be painting radiators in a home as part of a subsidized job. However, the people who worked at that home and the homeowners themselves had no memory of Jean being there, completely nullifying his alibi. While they couldn't pinpoint his exact location on the day of the murder, they could pinpoint where he went afterward, which didn't look good. A few months later, even though his girlfriend was pregnant, he abandoned her and left France for Switzerland to work as a metalworker with his brother. Very little documentation exists of his life in Switzerland. 2.5 years later he returned to Le Creusot and began displaying the early signs of schizophrenia. One report said, he no longer has his own identity, and so he has perceptions on his skin, on bone transformations that make him imagine that part of his body is like a snake. He would become more and more aggressive and delusional, often isolated himself from the rest of his surroundings, rarely did any real work and found himself in and out of psychiatric hospitals. At one of these hospitals, a doctor saw him talking to himself about Christelle's murder. He was staring at a mirror speaking to his own reflection. He was wondering if he knew the killer, said that the killer was speaking in his voice and that he was afraid of the killer. One time he even wondered, am I the one who killed her? Raphaël also dug up 2 old police reports from 1998 and 2000. Jean without notice had shown up at the police station to talk about Christelle's murder, even though he wasn't suspected at the time. He told the officers that he knew Christelle. He was infatuated with her, often dreamed about her in his sleep, that he heard her speak to him during his dreams, that he knew her well as a neighbor, and that he was interested in her, that he would have liked to go out with her, but was too afraid to speak with her. At the time, the police simply dismissed him as mentally ill, especially since he didn't actually have any insights into the murder itself and just came in to tell the police his personal feelings toward her. May 19, 2011, Jean had finally recovered enough for Raphaël to be permitted to question him. As he was still volatile mentally, Raphaël didn't push him too much and just let him speak freely in hopes he would slip up and implicate himself. That was exactly what happened. First, he admitted to being at La Charmel the day of the murder, and second, 2 people of having exchanged the switchblade after the murder. The length of this blade happened to match the one the police found. The problem, according to his first interrogation, he knew nothing about the case, a lie but one he stood by during this interview, and yet he somehow knew what weapon was used. Now for another fact about Jean, he was obsessed with knives. He often searched through every trash bin he came across in case it contained any discarded knives he could steal. He collected numerous blades and was said to always have a switchblade on his person, having never left his house without a blade. 3 weeks after the interview, the police obtained a warrant to search Jean's home and they discovered hundreds of knives. There were knives practically everywhere. In the drawers of the dressers, on the nightstands, hidden in the kitchen furniture, in the cabinets. They even found a box reserved for Jean and inside it contained only knives. One of them was very old and had been sharpened against stone and had the handle removed. The method for sharpening it was the same as the switchblade found in 1987. Raphaël compared the various knives to a picture of the one found at the scene and to the wounds inflicted on Christelle. The old, sharpened handleless knife was even superimposed against a picture of the one found at the crime scene. More specifically, they wanted to see if it had been sharpened using the same method. The patterns were nearly identical. The switchblade and the handleless blade found in Jean's home had been used by the same person. On December 13, 2011, Jean, now 44, was placed under arrest for the murder of Christelle Maillery. In only 2 years, Raphaël had done what the rest of the police spent 23 years failing to do. 25 years after the murder, Christelle's killer had finally been arrested. Jean seemed unaware of his many contradictions or that his home had been searched. He continued to insist that he knew nothing about the murder or even Christelle herself and seemed so confident that the police had no evidence, that he didn't even exercise his right to have a lawyer as he deemed it unnecessary. Raphaël showed him the police reports from 1998 and 2000 and asked for an explanation. In response, Jean called Raphaël a liar, said the reports were taken and that he never went to the police station nor said those words. Afterward, he decided to remain silent and refused to speak any further. Meanwhile, Jean's former girlfriend and brother were both questioned and shown pictures of the switchblade. Their memories remained sharp enough to tell the police that he did indeed own such a knife prior to the murder. Jean again continued to deny any involvement. He said the knife couldn't possibly be his because he was too much of a professional to use such rudimentary methods for sharpening a knife. When called on the resemblance he bore to the man the mailman saw, he insisted that was also untrue and that he never looked like that, despite photographs from his youth saying otherwise. Unfortunately for Jean, it was only a matter of time before he slipped up. He told Raphaël the following. "But you know, the crime scene, I know it. About 10 years after the murder, I had the urge to go see if there were any traces of blood left. There were 3 issues, the first being, why would he do that or feel the need to do so? Second, he claimed to know nothing about the case and yet he admitted to doing his own on-site investigation. Third, he pointed to the exact location in the basement where Christelle's body was found. A detail the public was never made aware of. While Jean never confessed, Raphael believed they had enough evidence and that Jean had dug his own grave sufficiently enough to put him before a judge. The judge agreed and indicted him for the murder. Raphael made sure to speak to Christelle's mother in private to let her know immediately before the news went public. Christelle's family were extremely grateful, and her mother even said that if it wasn't for Raphael and Raphael alone, the case would likely never be solved. On October 26, 2012, Jean was brought to the apartment building for a reenactment of the murder. Jean didn't do much reenacting as he still stood by his innocence. This was more a ploy to get him to slip up in front of other witnesses, most importantly, the investigating magistrate. He was asked to point out the place where he went back to search for traces of blood 10 years after the murder. He must have learned nothing from his interview with Raphael, as he still pointed to the exact location where Christelle's body was found, even though again, if he wasn't the killer he wouldn't know where to look. Jean also slipped up once again. The magistrate asked, "Where did your friend live, the one you visited every day at the time of the murder?" And once again, Jean tripped up and said, "But which floor, just above the young girls," another thing he wasn't supposed to know. The investigation soon ended with many convinced of his guilt. While Jean was most certainly the killer, could he be held responsible? Was he mentally incompetent, and could he have been so mentally ill that he might have been acquitted on an insanity defense even if he had been arrested at the time? The prosecution didn't think so. The first signs of mental illness appeared in 1989, so whatever his mental state may be now, he was likely sane at the time of the murder. On September 16, 2014, while being held at a mental hospital, he managed to escape when went on the run. He managed to evade capture for a day before he was arrested in Chalon-sur-Saône and returned to the hospital. His trial began on June 10, 2015, and despite the lack of any physical evidence, DNA, or a confession, the prosecution seemed confident they'd obtain a conviction with all the compelling circumstantial evidence and the many lies Jean had been caught in, including being privy to information he shouldn't be. Meanwhile, Jean pleaded not guilty and continued to insist that he knew nothing and had nothing to do with the murder. The most detrimental witness to the defense's case was Jean himself. A witness for the prosecution was called, and Jean constantly insulted her and even tried to attack her in open court. When the prosecutor questioned him directly with a simple question, "Is it you?" he reacted violently once more and demanded the prosecution shut up. The prosecution laid out all their evidence: his violent history, his alleged confession made to Christelle's boyfriend, all the incriminating statements and lies he told, his obsession with learning anything new about the case, his lack of an alibi, suspicious move to Switzerland not long after the murder weapon had been found, using the same knife sharpening technique used on the switchblade, and a knife he had in his possession in the present day, and his knowledge of the crime scene which only the killer and police would know. They were seeking 20 years imprisonment. The only reason they weren't seeking a life sentence was because of his mental state. Meanwhile, the defense was seeking an acquittal, not on grounds of insanity but just in general, as the evidence was deemed too circumstantial. They even had an explanation for his knowledge of the crime scene. The police had documents and crime scene photos out in the open which he could have caught a glance at with his mind subconsciously filling the blanks. On June 19, after 3.5 hours of deliberation, Jean-Pierre Mura was found guilty of the murder of Christelle Maillery and sentenced to 20 years imprisonment. Christelle's family were happy with the sentence and pleased that their nearly 30-year ordeal was finally over. Unfortunately, as he never took any responsibility, they still never got to know exactly what had happened that morning. Jean appealed his sentence, and in between his conviction and the appeal, he seemed determined to sink his chances at securing his freedom. Seemingly unaware that his mail would be screened or traced back to him, he sent a letter to the prosecutor general, addressing Christelle's former boyfriend. The letter said, "She killed your baby, Michel. I did well to cut the throat of that whore." When he was taken to court in Dijon on June 16, 2016, for the appeal, this letter was of course used as evidence. He continued to deny any involvement in spite of it. He even went so far as to say he didn't know what Christelle looked like. He also accused the police and courts of distorting his words and attributing false statements he never made to him. Every single witness, no matter what their testimony, were either lying or, in his own words, just talking bullshit. On June 24, the sentence was predictably upheld. Lastly, Jean appealed to the Court of Cassation, France's highest court. On July 11, 2017, they too upheld the sentence without a trial, finally bringing a definitive end to the case. Out of the 10 or 11 victims of the A6 missing women, Christelle's case is only one of 4 to actually see any resolution. It is unknown if the remaining 6 or 7 are all coincidences or the work of a serial killer. If this story moved you or made you think, please take a moment to like, share, and subscribe. Thank you for watching.